Zone 2 training. If you've spent any time around endurance athletes, you've probably heard it being hyped as the magical bullet for aerobic fitness. Build mitochondria, burn more fat, and become an endurance machine. Here's the thing, a new major review led by Professor Brendon Gurd has showed the story isn't that simple. In fact, a lot of what we believe about Zone 2 doesn't quite hold up when you put it under the microscope. Today, I'm going to take you through what the science actually says, what it means for your training, and the practical ways that you can adapt, especially if you're short on time. So this came from inspiration from my favorite podcast on all things endurance training, the Real Science of Sport podcast, where they talked about this review. The review is titled Much Ado About Zone 2, and the goal was to test the claims that Zone 2 gives you superior mitochondrial adaptations, and does it really unlock fat burning potential in trained athletes? So here's the verdict, straight in. Zone 2 doesn't reliably increase mitochondria beyond what other intensities do. The improvements are inconsistent and often quite small. The fat oxidation benefits are real, but mostly in untrained individuals. If you're new to endurance training, you'll see improvements, but once you're fit, those adaptations can quickly plateau. The biggest findings are that higher intensity training may actually produce bigger gains in VO2 max and mitochondrial function, especially when training time is limited. Okay, why this matters? It's important because Zone 2 has been marketed as the one true way to build endurance. But when time is limited, which is unfortunately reality for all of us, it might not be the most efficient use of our hours. So think about it. Most of us may only have 4 or 5 hours a week to train. Some people might even be listening to this thinking 4 to 5 hours, that sounds nice. I wish I had 4 to 5 hours. If you spend all that time cruising in Zone 2, you're probably not getting the best bang for your buck. You'll probably build volume, avoid injury, but you might not actually be able to push the needle and be able to get the performance that you're looking for. So if performance is something you're looking for, then obviously that's something to consider. However, there is people out there who just train for their brain, train to get out there. That's absolutely fine. But here we're talking about all things performance. Does it mean that Zone 2 is useless? No, it's absolutely valuable way for building your aerobic base, recovery, supporting polarized training. You've heard me speak before, and you've probably heard it endless times about 80-20, but the message is now clear that it's not the magic that shouldn't be the only tool in your diary. So this, the only tool in your arsenal when it comes to your endurance training. Often speak about things that we can utilize and having tools. So this is something that we should consider. So practical training implications. So what does it mean for your weekly training? If you're a beginner, Zone 2 absolutely still works. You can have all your training as Zone 2. It's low risk, it builds consistency and helps you learn pacing and learn more about your body. So that is really important and something that I would normally get people to do. Think of it as a pyramid. If you're a beginner, you want to first build that foundational base. You're probably not going to be fit enough to first start adding in different intensities, so that's absolutely fine. If you're experienced, you're only going to put Zone 2 in for easy volume recovery runs, but you're going to want to make sure that you add in structured intensity, which includes intervals, tempos, VO2 max work. This is the key point. If you're short on time, intensity matters more, as this is where you will see performance gains, okay? So this is obviously super important. I put together a list of practical examples for you for you're able to sort of put together. So let's say you've only got 3 sessions a week to train. Option 1, you're probably looking at 3 60-minute runs in Zone 2. You're going to be able to build endurance slowly, but you will see limited improvement in your VO2 max or speed. So that is for somebody who is, especially somebody who's been trained. Although if you have not trained at all, you will still see these adaptations, obviously because you are untrained. If you are a trained individual, you will not see that many adaptations. Option 2 is a polarized blend. So you would have a 60 to 90 minute run in Zone 2. one interval session per week, which would maybe be something like 6 times 4 minutes at threshold with recoveries at an easier pace with equal recoveries. So you're going to need to know your threshold pace, obviously, but I'm assuming if you've listened to this podcast, you probably know. If you don't know how to work these things out, please, you can send me a message or drop a message in the comments. I'm happy to help work this out for you. And then you're also going to do one tempo run, anywhere between 20 and 60 minutes, depending on your experience. And that's going to be, at probably around half marathon pace, probably sub threshold. And then as a result, you're going to be keeping your aerobic function with your longer 60 to 90-minute zone 2 run, but you're also going to train speed with interval sessions and also lactate thresholds and VO2 max work. There is another option 3, for someone who's totally time crunched. This is where you're going to have one optional long run in zone 2, and then the other one you're going to have 2 types of interval sessions with more short, sharp intervals, something like 2 minutes hard, 2 minutes easy for 6 to 8 times. And this is for someone who is really short on time, so you're able to go in, get it done, and absolutely smash it out. This will be big for boosting VO2 max gains. It's time efficient, but you need to be very careful with your recovery management if you're someone that is injury prone. This is something that you need to consider, and it might not be the absolute best thing for you. Zone 2 for professionals. So this is for somebody who works out. I wanted to touch on this because this is something they spoke about on the Real Science of Sport podcast, where they spoke about professionals who are training upwards of 30 hours a week. This is where zone 2 all of a sudden starts making so much more sense for somebody who's training in this level of intensity. Why does it make more sense? Because it's low stress on the nervous system and joints, but it lets you clock up a massive amount of aerobic volume without having too much downside. A pro cyclist will be able to ride 5 or 6 hours a day, mostly in zone 2 or maybe even zone 1, without breaking down. However, if they tried to do this in zone 4 or zone 5, I doubt they'd even last a week. So for professionals, it's more of a management tool of managing load, helping with promote recovery. Effectively, they're doing exactly what an amateur athlete is doing, but just at a greater scale. And this allows them to accumulate big hours without getting injury. And this also gives them a bigger base to be able to sort of stack things on. Like I said, the pyramid. So they're able to add on more volume, which is what more intensity on top of the pyramid that they're stacking, which is why I'm going to talk about the 80-20 model in context. So their situation is obviously very, very different, to the amateur athlete, and that's something to consider. And this is why you see these guys doing massive, massive, massive blocks of zone 2. So the 80-20 model in context, so this connects nicely with the sort of 80% training at low intensity with 20% high intensity. So this comes from observational data of elite endurance athletes when they looked at the sort of logs of pros, and this comes from Kenyan trained athletes, Tour de France athletes, Kenyan running athletes. So obviously they're training in huge volumes, so they're doing sort of 80% of it at their zone 1, zone 2. However, the 20% is still very hard, which is actually probably more than most recreational athletes are doing as a total sum of their weekly training, which is absolutely mad. But it's a principle and one that should be applied to your training, not as a general rule. Obviously, sometimes you might be stepping up and going a bit further. However, if you are a bit more of a time crunched athlete with only maybe 4 to 5 hours a week, this might be closer to 60-40, or depending how you're handling your recovery. Basically, the point is intensity distribution should match your total load and your personal context of what you are training for. Obviously, if you're not able to rack up 15, 16 hours a week, which might be considered high for someone with a full-time job, if you're training for, say, a marathon or an Ironman type event, you might be able to add in more zone 2 training, zone 1 training without seeing yourself burn out for the reasons I mentioned before. However, if you're a bit more time crunched, you're probably going to want to put together more intense sessions. You're also going to want to, take logs and see how you feel, see how your recovery is, and then also see how this affects you overall. I think this is really important to note as a training tool to make sure that you're diarizing, writing down how you feel after these different sessions. So that's really good. I want to talk about a few misconceptions about zone 2. So one misconception that the study revealed was that the belief that zone 2 equals more mitochondria or better mitochondrial growth, where it's not. This isn't actually true. I touched on this in the beginning in sort of the summary. Basically, high intensity work stimulates greater mitochondrial responses and is actually absolutely key, especially in trained athletes. Another misconception is that fat burning equals performance. However, it is true that fat burning happens better in zone 2 in your fat max zone, but it basically doesn't decide about your performance. VO2 max effectively will decide the level of your ceiling, and your lactate threshold will basically be your test of durability, how long you're able to work for at hard intensities, and running economy also plays a major factor. So this whole zone 2 thing isn't exactly the be all and end all for your running performance. However, it is important to have a balanced perspective. So it's not saying in this study time to throw zone 2 away. It's more about balance. So the zone 2 is your bread and butter. It's your main staple part of your dish. However, performance requires, the main part, which is intensity. So the program that you're going to be doing, obviously, if you're coached by myself, then it's managed by me, or if it's done by your your coach, your program is going to be polarized, meaning specific to your ability to train. So it's going to be able to sort of give you easy miles, be able to sort of build resilience, recovery, but also targeted intensity to drive adaptation. And that type of adaptation is the stuff that I was talking about: increase in VO2 max, better mitochondrial growth, and then obviously good to sort of work in those hard intensities ready for race performances as well. So it's obviously not one size fits all. Your background goals, available time is going to shape what your coach actually sets in. Obviously, if you're setting your own training, then this is something you might want to add in. You might want to add in one more intense session in the week. But basically, that's, just overall what I wanted to speak about. So just to sort of summarize, zone 2 isn't wrong, but it's not your only answer to your training. So it's part of your training toolkit. Obviously, the science now shows when you balance easy work with deliberate intensity, that's when you're going to see the biggest adaptation. So I want to hear a bit about your training in the comments. Last time I posted a video like this, I got attacked on Instagram by about 1.5 million people telling me that I was completely wrong. People who had been following the endurance training Bible and done the old Maffetone method, and they all told me I was wrong. However, a lot of these people had claims that, I did zone 2 for 6 months when I first started running, and I seen massive adaptation. And that's what I was talking about at the start, where this zone 2 only model is very, very beneficial, especially for a untrained athlete. Of course, you're going to see massive gains in every sort of aspect of your training, especially at the start. You went from 0 and then all of a sudden you start doing these training. Your body is going to adapt as you go. And it's also to note in the Maffetone method, for people who have read it, that even in that book, it states that once you're aerobically fit, you should be adding in intensity to your training if you want to get fitter. However, for some reason, a lot of people seem to skip that step. It's almost like they didn't read the whole of the book, because that chapter comes towards the end. And even Mr. Maffetone himself will even say that it is a key part of endurance recipe. However, you are going to want to get fit first and foremost. So I think that's a key point, but I do really appreciate when people engage in these conversations, and it really helps, help drive the conversation towards making people healthier and happier. Obviously, if you've got to the end of this video, please give it a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it, and I love recording these podcasts. If you do have suggestions for future videos, then please do let me know. So thanks very much for tuning in to this podcast, and I'll catch you on the next one.